AMD's new Radeon RX 5500 XT graphics card has launched at $200 for the 8GB model. But how does this compare against the older RX 580 8GB? I've compared 17 games at 1080p and 1440p resolutions to help you decide which to get or see if it's worth upgrading. Let's start out by looking at the differences in specs. The RX 580 is based on the 14nm GCN 4th Gen architecture and was released in April 2017, while the newer RX 5500 XT was released in December 2019 and uses the newest 7nm RDNA architecture. The 5500 XT has less compute units, less stream processors, but higher clock speeds. They both have 8GB of memory, however the 580 uses GDDR5 memory while the 5500 XT uses GDDR6. The 580 also has a higher TDP, so we're expecting it to use more power, but we'll compare that later. The 8GB RX 5500 XT launched at $200, while the RX 580 can currently be picked up new from $160 to $170. You can find updated prices linked in the description. For the testing, I'm using the Gigabyte RX 5500 XT Gaming OC 8GB and the Gigabyte RX 580 Gaming 8GB. The system that I'm testing with has an Intel i7-8700K CPU overclocked to 5GHz on all cores in an MSI Z390 Ace motherboard, along with 16GB of DDR4 3200 CL14 memory and dual channel. You can check the links in the description for details on all of the components, as well as for up-to-date pricing. Testing was done with the latest Windows 1909 fully up to date, and with the latest Radeon drivers available at the time of testing. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into the results. Call of Duty Modern Warfare was tested in campaign mode. I've got the 1080p results on the lower half of the graph, and the 1440p results towards the upper half. In this test, there was a 15% higher average frame rate with the 5500 XT, and stepping up to 1440p, the difference lowered to a 10% lead for the 5500 XT. Control was one of the only games where I was consistently seeing a slightly lower frame rate with the 5500 XT. This time the RX 580 was performing 5% faster in terms of average FPS. However, the 1% lows were much more similar comparatively. Red Dead Redemption 2 was tested using the game's built-in benchmark tool. In this test at 1080p, the 5500 XT had a 7% higher average frame rate, lowering slightly to a 6% improvement at 1440p. Battlefield 5 was tested in campaign mode. In terms of average FPS, at 1080p, the results are within margin of error. However, the 1% low was a bit further ahead. At 1440p, the 1% low results are much closer together. However, the 5500 XT was only 3.6% ahead in average FPS. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was tested with the game's benchmark tool, and there wasn't too much of a difference in this test. At 1080p, the 5500 XT was just under 7% faster, and at 1440p, it was only a couple of FPS higher, which translates to almost a 5% boost. Apex Legends was tested with all graphical settings at maximum, and there was only a 6 and 4% higher average FPS at 1080p and 1440p respectively. However, there was a larger improvement seen in the 1% lows. At 1080p, the 5500 XT has a 22% higher 1% low, and 10% higher at 1440p. Borderlands 3 was tested with the game's benchmark tool, and at 1080p, this game saw the largest difference out of all 17 titles that I've tested, with almost a 25% higher average frame rate and a 1% low that was above even the average from the 580. At 1440p, it's still a fair win for the 5500 XT, however the difference lowered to a 12.5% improvement. Fortnite was tested using the replay feature with the exact same replay file used for all testing. At 1080p, the 5500 XT was almost 10% higher in average FPS, dropping down to a 7% improvement once we increased the resolution to 1440p. PUBG was also tested using the replay feature, with the same replay file again. At both resolutions, the 5500 XT was around 7% faster in terms of average FPS. Assassin's Creed Odyssey was tested using the built-in benchmark. Nothing too special here to mention. At 1080p, the 5500 XT was 13% higher in average FPS, lowering a little to 12.5% higher at 1440p. The Witcher 3 tends to be a fairly GPU-heavy game. However, the differences in this test were quite minimal, with just a 2 to 3% increase seen in average frame rate with the 5500 XT. The Division 2 was tested with the game's benchmark tool, and the 5500 XT was almost 9% higher in average FPS at 1080p and 8% at 1440p. Ghost Recon Breakpoint was also tested using the built-in benchmark, and there was an above-average improvement here. At 1080p, the 5500 XT was almost 20% ahead in average FPS, rising up to a 16.5% improvement at 1440p. Overwatch was tested in the practice range, so while not quite the same as actual gameplay, it allows me to perform the same test pass more accurately, which is ideal for comparison purposes. At 1080p, there was a decent 14% higher average frame rate with the 5500 XT, lowering slightly to a 12% higher average FPS at 1440p. Rainbow Six Siege was tested with the game's benchmark tool. At 1080p, there was almost a 7% increase to average FPS with the 5500 XT, but at 1440p, the difference lowered to just a 2% boost, or a little over a 1 FPS change with a little more improvement seen to 1% low. Strange Brigade was tested using Vulkan and also with the built-in benchmark, and in this case, the results were essentially the same between both. At 1080p, the 580 was a little ahead, but realistically, they're so close it's still within margin of error. Then a similar deal at 1440p with the 5500 XT now just 1 FPS higher. I've tested CSGO with the Euletical FPS benchmark, and this test saw one of the largest improvements out of all games tested. At 1080p, there's a nice 24% improvement to average FPS. Then at 1440p, this rose greatly to a massive 30% higher average frame rate. Over all 17 games tested, the newer RX 5500 XT was around 9.5% faster than the older RX 580. As you can see though, it really depends on the specific game, but in general, the 5500 XT does have an edge in performance. At 1440p, the overall average lowers slightly to the RX 5500 XT having an 8% higher average frame rate. Although I wouldn't personally be looking to buy either of these for 1440p gaming, you could definitely use them in many games with lower settings. Total system power draw from the wall had some interesting results. Despite offering high levels of performance, AMD's new 7nm architecture is clearly more power efficient. I've measured power in 2 different games, and in both cases, the RX 580 was using more than 30% more power than the 5500 XT, and that's while the 5500 XT was outperforming the 580. As both cards I'm testing with have different cooling solutions, I haven't looked at thermals, as it would be less of a fair comparison. Due to that lower power draw though, I'd expect the 5500 XT to run a bit cooler, and as a result, quieter. Now for the final difference, the price. You can find updated prices linked in the description. At the time of recording, the 5GB 5500 XT has launched at $200 while the RX 580 seems to be available new for $160. However, $170 seems to be more common, though there are of course also cheaper second-hand options as it's been out for over 2 years. In terms of cost per frame, the older RX 580 is better value. I've included it with both the lowest $160 amount on Newegg, but also at $170, which seems to be more widely available. If you've already got an 8GB 580, there's not really much reason to upgrade to the 5500 XT. In most games tested, the performance difference just isn't enough to justify it. If you're looking at buying today though, then the 580 is a better deal in terms of dollar per frame, and it's still offering a good 1080p gaming experience. You could argue that the power efficiencies from the newer 5500 XT are beneficial, but you're going to seriously need to play a lot of games over the course of a year before seeing much difference in your power bill. In the end, it seems like more people prefer higher frame rates at the expense of more power anyway. Honestly, in terms of performance improvement, given the RX 580 came out over 2.5 years ago, we're not seeing much gain compared to the price. It may have made more sense to compare the RX 590, but I don't currently have one of those available for testing. So with all of that in mind, which would you pick? The newer RX 5500 XT or older RX 580? Let me know in the comments, and if you're new to the channel, consider getting subscribed for future comparisons and tech videos like this one.